In the 1960s, when I was a schoolboy, I used to travel with a man called Wihuata. He was the Anglican Maori missioner in the Diocese of Waikato. This man was related to my mother, and so we had a link. And he was responsible for training lay Maori people to act as evangelists across the diocese. And the white bishop of that diocese gave him free rein to do that. Didn't write any prescriptions for him, didn't say to him, these are the qualifications these people must have. He just said to him, you know what needs to be done out there, you know who to find out there that can actually meet the needs of our mission in this diocese. And he went out and did it. And he chose ordinary folk. And their task was to actually act as prayer leaders in various Maori communities. And they were given designated areas. They were paid a minimum sum. It probably would have been about a third of a stipend. No travel allowance. They had to provide their own vehicle, provide their own housing, and these people went out and became evangelists and missioners to Maoris in the community. There were already some parish churches that were built early in the late 1800s. Most of them were built about 1870, 1880. But the idea was not just to minister to Anglicans, it was to minister to all Maori people within a given area. It didn't matter what denomination they were, and in that way they started to discover who the Anglicans were in the community. And when you asked Wihuata what he was doing, he'd just say, are we getting out there? If you asked him to give you a program that these people could follow, he'd say, what do you need that for? They're getting out there and doing the work. And it actually did work. And some of those people were eventually offered ordination by the bishop at the prompting of this man, Canon Wihuata. And so those were the first ordinands that literally grew up out of the community. During that period, my father showed an interest in priesthood. Now, my father was a dairy farmer, and in 1955, he intimated to his bishop that he would like to pursue ordination. And the bishop said, well, you have to be qualified with some kind of tertiary certificate. And he said, like what? Well, you had to have done matriculation. He said, that's the equivalent of university entrance. My father said, I did that in 1918. And so the bishop said to him, oh, so why didn't you? He said, when I matriculated, I went home. In the meantime, my younger brother had expressed a wish while he was still only about 10 or 12 years of 10 or 11, and he said, I would like to train to be a priest. So I stayed home with my younger brothers and older brothers, and we worked to raise money to send that brother to school, send him on to university, and then from there he went to theological college. Now that brother was our Maori expert. In fact, he was one of the country's experts in Hebrew studies and in Greek. He was a linguistic nut. He read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, English, and Maori. And this man used to walk around with a Bible, with the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek Bible, and he read straight from the Greek and translate it into Maori. And we'd be following our Bibles and go, how words are different from what he's saying? And we'd follow the Old Testament reading, and afterwards we'd say to him, where'd you get the reading from? Oh, from here. And he'd give us the Hebrew writings. Now, as a result of his ministry, my father became influenced, and he wanted to become a priest. But the bishop said, well, he had to go to theological school, and he said, I can't. I have children at secondary school, and I can't afford to walk away from my farm and just abandon what is my livelihood. And the diocese over the hill where Canon Wihuta was heard about my father's wish. So he rang my father and he said, if you come within the next week or so, you and I can have a conversation and we can figure out when I ordain you. And my dad, up to that point, had been a lay reader for 25 years. Now, when his own bishop heard what the other bishop had done, his own bishop rang him and said, now don't be hasty, Tipe. I want you to wait. I can ordain you. Let's not be in a hurry. And in 1950s, at the end of 1956, my father became what they call a stipendiary lay reader. They put him into a parish, and he became the lay reader in a parish. And it was his task to evangelize and to be the missioner in this area. And then 6 months later, he was ordained deacon. He was a deacon for a year, and what happened was the archdeacon used to come, the Pākehā archdeacon used to come, sit with him, and ensure that he was doing everything correctly. Doing all the paperwork that was needed by the diocese, and he would help my father with and critique his sermons. Now, my dad was a very good orator. He was also a very good writer. He was the secretary of every committee going in the village, and he was the local justice of the peace, so he knew how to write documents. Very skilled writer. And a year after he was made deacon, they priested him. And then his younger brother also expressed a wish to be ordained, but the diocesan bishop wouldn't look at the younger brother because he didn't have the qualification my father did. So that one, my father said to him, you won't get anything here, go to see the other Pākehā bishop. So he went to the other Pākehā bishop, who said, okay, what are you doing at the moment? He said, well, I've got a job milking cows. Good. You carry on milking cows for a year, and after a year, you work at this parish here, and after a year, we'll look at paying you a stipend and making you a stipendiary lay reader. Now, Gordon did that for, about 6 years. I was ordained in 1965. My dad's youngest brother was ordained a year later. Now, he hadn't been to theological school. So ordaining people that didn't have to go to theological school began way back in the mid-1950s. In the 1970s, we struck a critical stage. They realized that I was the youngest priest in the diocese, in fact the youngest priest throughout the country, youngest Maori priest, and that there were no other candidates coming forward. We began then to look at the possibility of ordaining other people without them having to go to theological school, but the bishops wouldn't agree because it's not in the canons. And of course the Maoris have said, who needs the canons? All we need is people to be ordained. What's your problem? And we struck that, but we stuck at it, and we were lucky. Paul Alfred Reeves, a person of Maori descent, became a diocesan bishop. He became my bishop. I left Paul's episcopacy in 1972 and went to university. And in 1973-74, Paul Reeves started what they now call Minita a iwi training. And he did that by going to each of the Maori communities and saying to those communities, do you have people in your communities capable of leading in worship? And each of the communities said, yes, we have. He said, I don't want one, I want at least 3 people. And the first community he went to, they found him 3 men, and each of them was over the age of 70. The oldest one was 75. And he ordained them deacons. Now the 75-year-old at the ordination was asked to read the gospel. He stood up at the reading of the gospel, held it up in the air, and he read the gospel as if it was his own story. He didn't even look at the book. Did it all in Maori language. And then when he finished, he waved the Bible around and said, this is the gospel of Christ. Just like he would his walking stick, you see. I mean, when we do our speeches, we carry a stick, which you wave everywhere. Well, he used the Bible like that to emphasize points. He would go with the Bible. And everybody, you could have heard a pin drop on the marae as he read this, because he became a participant in the story that he was telling. And Paul Reeves, before he laid hands on him, he said, before I lay my hands on you, I want you to guarantee me that you will give me at least 10 years you'll give me the next 10 years of full ministry. And he says, you got it. That man died when he was 88. And he was still celebrating the Eucharist in his community at the age of 88. And so were his colleagues. Now, as a result of those 3 being ordained, other communities said to Bishop Paul and to the Maori Bishop, Bishop Manuhuia, please come to see us and talk to us. Because we think we have people who you would consider as candidates, and the thing mushroomed. Now, by the year 1984, we had a new bishop, a Maori bishop, Hui Verko, who then asked me to begin a ministry education program for all of these people that had been ordained to do a continuing ministry. And I said, I don't have a program. He said, don't worry about a program. Just go out there and do it. And it reminded me of Canon Wihura. So I thought, yeah, we won't bother writing anything up. Let's just get out there and hear what they want.
At St. John's Theological College, when I was a student there, the Reverend Honika was running a program called the Minita EV program, which was to bring the ministry out to the people and to look at people like the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and to understand that ordained ministry does not have to be an academic theologian, a deep thinker. That what we needed in the community were sacramentalists. We needed people who were visitors, a healing ministry, or sacramentalists on Sunday to do the liturgy. That you had different roles. You didn't have to be a Superman or super person in one row and do everything. That you could have a baker, a candlestick maker, a butcher in a village, and they all worked together. But they had to be trained. And they couldn't go to a seminary, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the time, and you weren't looking at a ministry that broke apart families and communities and say, okay, we're going to take this person out of this community and dump them into this school for 3 years and disconnect them from that community. We're going to take the school and put it in the community.
And I had 135 candidates, and they were aged between 75 and 35. And all of them were orators in their own communities, speakers in their communities, leaders in their communities, and they'd all been ordained. I mean, people would come to our ministry schools and they'd ask me, what are we doing today? I said, I don't know. Just let the house tell us what to do.
So he would come to St. John's and say, okay, we're going out to Gisborne or somewhere. And then basically in those days, it was too expensive to travel by air. So he would drive, and he really wanted a sidekick to be with him to keep him company on the road. So I did that, and I got to meet a lot of people, Maori people, native peoples, more than I did anyone else. Stay at their homes, meet them, and I was the first Hawaiian who basically many of them met. We would go to the schools, to a marae, Maori meeting home, house. We'd stay over the weekend with them, we'd eat and we'd sleep with them, and Honi would say one time, okay, I have to do this and this and this, there's a whole other group of people here, why don't you teach them how to do a sermon? Or this and that, or take the Old Testament lesson and do hermeneutics with them, or this and that. And so I was forced to become part of the training, that is the teacher with them. And you would get these interesting people from all kinds of backgrounds, and their families, their kids, their wives, or partners, or whoever. And they were all there as a community, as a village, learning together. A tremendous motto about ministry, because as they learned, the people who were chosen to be the leadership, they learned. The people who would support them were also being trained and learned too. So that this was not done, again, in isolation, but this was done in a manner that is very indigenous.
Much of my training took place in what we call our marae. And in our marae we have a meeting house, much like this, but on the walls are carved figures and beautiful paintings. And we were in one of these houses, and the local diocesan bishop, Pākehā bishop, was lying beside me, and he said, what's the class going to be on tonight? And I said, I don't know, the walls will tell me. He said, the what? I said, the walls. So we had our worship at 7 o'clock. Then we were lying down, and I stood up and I said to this old man, who was the principal speaker for this house, I said to him, tell me, who's that figure behind you? And he went to turn around and said, don't look. Tell me, read him with your hand. And he put his hand up and he says, no. I can't read this one. Why not? He said, because if you look around the house, all the figures are the same. I said, so this is your tribal house. Why are the figures all the same? He said, because this house was built by amateurs. All of the people who carved these carvings were all beginner carvers. He said, and the head carver said, as you're all learning, I will show you one figure, I will carve one, and you will imitate me while I'm carving. So all of the figures in the house, and there were 13 down one side, and 12 down the other side. Because when you carve your figures, you should always have an odd number. They should never be even all the way down. So 13 on one side and 12 the other. Because the house is named after a human being, you see. If the house is perfect, then the house is no longer named after a human being. It is the house of the gods, and you cannot use it. And so that's why it's always an odd number. And I said, so how many of you got houses that are carved like this, and one by one they all started to stand up and say, oh no, our house, every carving is different. Now how can you tell when you're lying at the foot of the carving who the ancestor is? Oh, I can feel his feet. And what have his feet got to do with it? Because there are markings on his feet. And then I go up his knees. I said, oh, we'll go any further than that. Because in all our carvings, the penis is done as a full part of the figure, you see. I said, that'll do, we'll just stop at the knees. No, I haven't finished yet. And he described every piece of the carving. I said, okay, who in here knows where in Scripture the Hebrews used the carving? And suddenly this old man sat up and he said, oh, they used it on the lintel of the door. You know, it was always on the left side of the door. And I said, now what did that signify? Well, they could touch it and they knew whose house it was. What did that indicate? Well, there's a family that was connected with that house. And they knew it was the house of David or the house of Abraham or the house of so-and-so. So is that why our houses are carved the way they are? I said, yeah. Because each of the carvings represents an ancestor from out of our tribe. Now, the debate went on, and we talked about the significance of the tattoo. Cain belonged to a tribal people. If he were unmarked, it meant that you could be killed by anybody. If you had a tattoo on you, which is a mark, you belonged to someone, and therefore you were respected and treated as holy. Cain was left by God to be unmarked. But nobody wanted to kill Cain. So he was separated out. And nobody wanted anything to do with him. And that was and all of that came out of the discussion with these old men as they worked through the scripture themselves. And I know that a lot of our people actually read the Bible, but you don't know what they know until you actually find the point of entry into their lives, which sparks a discussion amongst them.
That kind of learning has stayed with me with a long time. And my relationship with Honika has been unique in the sense that all the talking, the dialogue that we had traveling has remained with me. This, particularly the sense where he talks about the deconstruction and reconstruction of your culture to find the Christ in that culture, I think has been remarkable, the insight. And in that regard, I really do feel that Hone's personal development is tremendous as a theologian, as a thinker. But that the Minita EV program that he was running is equally important, because we should not in the church be developing everyone to be a theologian. That's ridiculous. I mean, we have too many arguments. Everybody would be stuck on how many angels dance on the head of a pin. What we need is also action. And we need more people in the action ministry than we do in the thinking ministry. Okay? And I think that's an important point, because the action ministry means visiting people, means waking up on Sunday morning, having a sermon, being able to give a sermon, and yet having the resources to think about that. And that's where a theologian, I believe, really helps. It helps those in action discover or rediscover the Word and the meaning of that word, and they put it into experience.
If you want ministry to flower in Hawaii, then you have to consider radical changes. You have to rethink your whole mission and evangelism to native Hawaii.
Particularly here in this diocese, people say, well, people should be ordained for the entire church and not for a specific ministry. And I go back partly to that lesson in the gospel that we read just a Sunday or two ago that says, if you do this to the least of me, you have done this to me. I think that's not a guilt obligation. That is a fulfillment of the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, the storyteller, the healer, the itinerant minister. That's being a follower of Jesus, to look at the least. And the way that colonial history has treated and developed indigenous peoples, they are the least, beyond any statistical data. So the church should have an obligation to deal with Native ministries. But I think it goes more than just the social welfare part. As indigenous peoples, who are the first peoples of the world, but now the last peoples of the world to even be considered important, as we have a voice, find the action, begin to feel the political clout and social clout that has been long overdue, the church needs to realize that beyond the politics, beyond the welfare, the social remedies, the monies, the casinos, the economics, is that going back to the original part that I was saying about relationships, is also beyond the relationship of being a people, is a relationship with the divine. And that who will, it won't be government, it won't be the tribal government, it won't be anyone else, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that cares about the spiritual growth, that relationship. And without that part of it, of the relationship, the other part all fails. We become just like anybody else. It's that unique part of understanding that religio, that link to the divine, that has separated indigenous peoples from other peoples in this world, still to this day. You cannot lose that part and call yourself indigenous. That is part and parcel of who you are, whether you're a flaming Marxist radical or the most ultra-conservative. That's what links this group into a people, is that understanding of the divine. As much we can equate to that relationship that the Hebrew people have to Jehovah. But if there is no institution, there is no group that is willing to go the distance to help do this in partnership with indigenous people, then they will go out and do it themselves. And this is what the danger is that we're finding. Because in modern society, we find that indigenous peoples become separated, they become not just diverse, they become divergent from becoming a people because they're torn apart by denominational structures, by political structures, by secularism. And yet they're trying to find this unity and core. And the church can offer that unity and core in Christ, in its understanding of the deeper message, which doesn't seem to always get out of what Jesus the Christ is saying in the Gospels, which takes traditional indigenous culture and goes boom to even a further level that we haven't known about. And that's a gift that when we do find that, and I know it does exist, that sharing to other peoples will get us further to that gate at Jerusalem. So that investment there, if you want to look at it in economic terms, that investment there is not just an investment to help the least of my people, the least of these sheep of the flock. It is indeed, in its final end, in the long-term vision, something that will affect each and every one of us in our relationship to the divine through Christ. It will shift our eyes that we are no longer blind and we cannot hear, we're deaf mutes and so forth, and will give us the voice and the vision to see beyond ourselves, because when we know someone else's culture, we become wise.